It's sunrise, around 1450 BCE. Your youngest child has diarrhea. The grain jar is running low. Your husband has already left for work, and there is another baby at your breast. You cannot assume a physician is coming. You cannot pay for a professional wet nurse. You cannot turn a handle and get clean water from a pipe. And if you spend the whole day caring for one sick child, something else your family depends on does not get done. So the question is not only, can this child survive? It is, what else has to be sacrificed so this child can survive? This is the ancient Egypt we rarely see. Not the palace, not the painted tomb, not the household with servants carrying trays, the family with almost no room for a bad week. So how did poorer Egyptians keep their children alive? The answer is less dramatic than a royal tomb, but much more revealing. Before we answer that, we need to define poor, because ancient Egypt did not have a modern poverty line. There was no census form with a box marked low income. What we can see are differences in housing, burial, food access, occupation, and material wealth. So in this video, poor means non-elite families with limited surplus. Families who could not solve every problem by buying more labor, more food, or more expertise. And that changes the question. A wealthy household can sometimes purchase a backup. A poor household usually has to turn whatever is already there into the backup. Milk, grain, relatives, a room, a charm, time. Keep those 5 things in your head, because one of them may be the most expensive resource in the whole house. But there is a problem. The people we most want to hear from are the people least likely to have left us a voice. Most farmers, laborers, and ordinary women did not write biographies. Their childcare manuals did not survive because, as far as we know, they did not have childcare manuals. Archaeologists are left with houses, bones, pots, legal lists, medical texts written by other people, and the things families buried with the dead. So this is not a story where every sentence comes from one perfect document. It is a reconstruction. In other words, the poorest families left us almost no voice, but they did leave traces. And the first clue is almost embarrassingly simple. Food entered the child through the mother. Royal families could use wet nurses. Egyptian art and texts show that elite wet nurses could hold status and importance. But historical studies of infant feeding in Egypt point out that poorer women normally breastfed their own babies and looked for another nursing woman mainly when the mother could not feed the child herself. That sounds like a detail about motherhood. For a low-resource family, it is much bigger than that. Breastfeeding is food that does not need to be purchased from a market. It does not need to be ground. It does not need fuel for cooking. It does not need a storage jar. And while a baby is nursing, the family can delay some of the risks that come with preparing other food and drink. Why does that matter so much? Because every step outside the body adds risk. Ancient Egyptian evidence also points to long periods of nursing. A famous instruction text describes a mother nursing her child for 3 years. That does not mean every Egyptian child everywhere was breastfed for exactly 36 months. Egypt lasted thousands of years. Practice changed. Families differed. But 3 years is not a random number either. It points to a long, slow crossing from one danger zone into another. Later scientific work on Egyptian remains has also found patterns consistent with gradual weaning over the first years of life. Now pause on what that means for a poor household. The mother is not simply feeding the baby, she is carrying part of the family's food system on her body. And there is a second advantage. The moment a child begins taking more water and prepared food, the number of things that can go wrong increases. The Nile made Egyptian civilization possible. It also meant that people lived around water, irrigation, animals, insects, human waste, and parasites. Ancient Egyptian bodies preserve evidence for parasitic disease. In any pre-modern settlement, food and water safety were problems people had to manage without knowing what microbes were. A small child does not need to understand any of that. A small child only needs to lose fluid too quickly. A cup of water could be necessary, ordinary, and dangerous at the same time. So imagine the transition. For months or years, much of the child's nutrition comes directly from nursing. Then, slowly, the child joins the household diet. Bread, porridge, other grain foods, water from storage vessels, whatever the family can spare. Bread and beer were staples of the Egyptian diet, and grain also functioned as a major economic resource. For a household with little surplus, grain was not just dinner. Grain was stored labor. Now the danger changes. The question is no longer only, do we have food? It becomes, can this small body handle the food and water we have? And here is the first big reversal in this story. Birth was dangerous. Of course it was. But surviving birth did not mean the crisis was over. Weaning could open a new window of vulnerability because a child was moving away from nursing and deeper into the same food and water environment as everyone else. That is where poverty hurts in a very specific way. A richer household has more choices. A poorer household has fewer substitutions. If the grain is bad, you still need grain. If the water source is questionable, you still need water. If one caregiver is exhausted, there may not be another paid person waiting behind her. So what replaces money? People. This is the part of ancient childcare that is easy to miss if we imagine a modern nuclear family dropped into a mud brick house. If there is no paid backup, who becomes the backup? Egyptian household records sometimes show more complicated family units. One Middle Kingdom set of household lists from Lahun follows a man named Hori. At different points, the household includes his wife and son, but also his mother and sisters. In another record, children, adult relatives, and servants can appear inside the same domestic unit. That does not prove every poor child had a grandmother, 3 aunts, and a perfect support network. Real families are never that tidy. But it does show something important. The household could be bigger than mother, father, and children. And for a family with little spare wealth, extra adults were not decorative. They were capacity. But capacity is never free. Someone can watch a toddler while food is prepared. Someone can carry water. Someone can stay with a sick child while another adult works. Someone can remember what happened the last time a baby stopped feeding. Someone can be awake when someone else finally falls asleep. Think of it as insurance that does not exist on paper. A family with no financial buffer may survive by creating a human buffer. But that creates a brutal trade-off. Every useful pair of hands is also a mouth to feed. Every older child who helps at home is also a child whose own childhood is becoming work. And that brings us to the part of this story that does not fit the warm picture. Before we judge those choices, we have to ask what help was actually available. First, though, we need to deal with medicine. Ancient Egypt absolutely had medical knowledge. There were physicians, there were written prescriptions, there were specialist traditions. The surviving medical manuscripts include material on pregnancy, childbirth, illness, wounds, and treatments. But here is the mistake people make. A medical text exists. Therefore, every Egyptian had access to the medicine inside it. Those are not the same claim. The surviving papyri come from a literate world. Literacy itself was specialized. A prescription written by a trained scribe tells us that knowledge existed somewhere in Egyptian society. It does not tell us that a farm worker's wife in a small settlement could summon the right specialist on demand. So if you want to understand low-resource childcare, start with a different question. Not, what medicine did Egypt know? Ask, what could this household actually reach today? Maybe a local healer? Maybe an experienced woman? Maybe a plant or ingredient already used in the house? Maybe advice remembered from an older relative? Maybe nothing that we would call effective medicine. And when the physical options became thin, there was another tool almost everywhere in Egyptian family life: protection. Bess looks strange to modern eyes. He is short, front-facing, often fierce, sometimes comic, sometimes armed. Toweret combines the body of a pregnant hippopotamus with other dangerous animal features. Both became closely connected with childbirth, women, children, and domestic protection. To us, that may look like the moment medicine ends and superstition begins. But the real question is not, did the charm cure disease? The real question is, what did the charm make people do? For an Egyptian family, that line would make much less sense. A charm could sit beside a practical remedy. A spoken protection could happen while someone was feeding, washing, holding, or watching the child. One action did not cancel the other. And here is why this matters especially for our topic. Ritual can travel cheaply. A specialist cannot be in every room. A rare ingredient cannot be in every jar. But a spoken formula can be remembered. A protective image can be copied in cheap material as well as expensive material. A household practice can move from one generation to the next without a school. I am not saying a spell kills bacteria. It does not. I am saying a ritual can still change what people do. It can tell a frightened adult, "Stay here." It can give a threat a name. It can create a repeated sequence when panic would otherwise take over. And sometimes in childcare, repeated attention is not nothing. Here is a useful way to think about it. If you strip away the divine language for 1 second, many protective practices are about boundaries. This child is vulnerable. This room matters. This night matters. Someone should be close. Something dangerous is outside the safe zone. That is not germ theory. The cause can be completely wrong. But the behavior can still produce care. Now, do not romanticize it. This is where a lot of history videos cheat. They find one practice that looks clever from a modern angle and turn an entire civilization into accidental scientists. That is not what the evidence says. Poor Egyptian families still lost children. They still faced infections, malnutrition, injury, childbirth complications, and diseases they could not diagnose. A protective charm could organize fear. It could not replace antibiotics. Long breastfeeding could reduce some risks. It could not make a child invulnerable. A large household could provide hands. It could also be overcrowded, hungry, and exhausted. So the real system was not good. It was what people had. And if you want to see how hard that could become, go to Amarna. Amarna is dangerous evidence because it is both incredibly useful and incredibly unusual. Still, unusual evidence can show us ordinary stress under extreme pressure. It was a purpose-built royal city. It existed for a short period. Its population was connected to one of the strangest political and religious experiments in Egyptian history. So we cannot take Amarna and say, this is what every poor family in Egypt experienced for 3,000 years. But the human remains from its non-elite cemeteries show what severe stress could look like. Researchers have found widespread signs of nutritional deficiency, disease, trauma, and heavy physical labor. Some children as young as about 6 show degenerative joint changes. 6 years old is young enough to still need protection, and old enough in some households to begin carrying burden. And one cemetery is even stranger. At the North Tomb Cemetery, the excavated sample is overwhelmingly young. Among individuals that could be aged precisely, almost all fall between about 5 and 25 years. The bones show extreme workloads. Researchers have suggested this cemetery may have served a population of young laborers. That interpretation is still preliminary. But the bones do not need a dramatic voiceover. Children and young people were being pushed hard enough for the skeleton to remember. And now the question changes again. What does it mean to keep a child alive in a poor household? Alive until age 1? Alive until weaning? Alive until they can contribute? Alive until adulthood? Because in a subsistence economy, a child gradually changes economic category. At first, the child consumes care. Later, the child may begin contributing labor. That transition can help the household survive. It can also place new stress on the child. This is the part that ruins the simple story. A family can love a child and still need that child to work. A parent can protect a baby at night and send an older child into hard labor later. Those ideas feel contradictory to us because we like moral categories that stay clean. History rarely gives us that luxury. Now go back to the house from the beginning. Now the opening scene should look different. The sick child is on the floor mat. The grain jar is low. One adult is away working. Another baby needs milk. What are the actual resources in the room? Not much, but not zero. There is the mother's body. There is stored grain. There may be relatives nearby. There is accumulated household knowledge. There may be a protective object or spoken ritual. And there is time. Time may be the most expensive thing in the room. This is the fifth resource from the beginning, and it may be the cruelest one. A sick child needs attention. Attention means somebody is not grinding grain, carrying water, weaving, tending animals, working in a field, or helping produce whatever keeps the household going. This is why poverty changes childcare so deeply. The cost of care is not only the object you buy, it is the work you stop doing. Modern parents still understand this immediately. Take a day off work to stay with a sick child, and you feel the equation. Now remove paid leave, pharmacies, refrigeration, piped water, emergency departments, and antibiotics. The equation gets much sharper. And that may be the most useful way to understand poor families in ancient Egypt. Do not imagine them as people with no technology. Imagine them as people whose technology was mostly social. Their technology did not always look like tools. Sometimes it looked like a person staying awake. The body, the household, memory, routine, shared labor, stored food. Simple objects used again and again. This was not enough to defeat ancient childhood mortality, but it was enough to shift the odds for some children. There is another clue that families invested in those children even when they died. Infants are sometimes surprisingly hard to find in formal Egyptian cemeteries. Earlier scholars could look at that absence and imagine indifference. Absence in the cemetery can lie, but archaeology complicates the picture. At Lahun, infant burials were found in boxes beneath house floors. Baby burials have also been recorded at Deir el-Medina. That does not give us permission to read a modern emotion directly into the ground. A burial custom is not a diary, but it does mean the child was not simply absent from ritual treatment. In some cases, the dead infant was placed inside the domestic space itself. The house that had failed to keep the child alive became the place that kept the child close. And this is where the title of the video finally turns inside out. How did poor ancient Egyptian families keep their children alive? The answer is not one secret remedy. It is not one god. It is not one miracle food. It is not that Egyptians somehow knew modern medicine without knowing modern medicine. The answer is a stack of small defenses. Nurse for a long time when you can. Stretch staple food. Use every available pair of hands. Pass experience through the household. Reach formal healers when they are reachable. Use ritual when fear has no other structure. Watch the child. Keep working. Then watch the child again. None of those actions is dramatic enough to build a pyramid around. That is exactly why they disappear from history. Palaces preserve the decisions of kings. Poor households preserve fewer traces because survival itself consumes the material that might have become a monument. Food gets eaten, cloth wears out, wood rots, advice is spoken and vanishes. A mother can keep a child alive for 3 years and leave behind no inscription saying she did it. That is the historical problem. The most important work in the household may be the work least likely to survive. And there is one final thing I do not want to smooth over. One final caution makes the story less tidy but more honest. We have better evidence from places like Lahun, Deir el-Medina, and Amarna than we do from countless ordinary villages. Deir el-Medina, in particular, was not a generic poor farming village. It housed skilled workers connected to royal tomb construction. Amarna was a royal capital with its own unusual conditions. So whenever someone tells you exactly how the average poor Egyptian family lived across 3,000 years, be careful. There was no single average family. Upper Egypt was not the Delta. The Middle Kingdom was not the New Kingdom. A skilled state worker was not a landless laborer, and a widow with 4 children faced a different equation from a household full of adult relatives. The honest version is less tidy, but I think it is also better, because once you stop looking for one Egyptian parenting system, you start seeing the real pattern. Wealth buys options. Poverty removes options. And when options disappear, people turn relationships, habits, bodies, and beliefs into infrastructure. That is what this family in the opening had. Not nothing. Infrastructure made out of people. The same 5 things from the beginning are still here, but now they look different. The mother feeding one child while watching another. The relative who carries water. The older person who remembers a remedy. The sibling who watches the doorway. The charm that tells everyone this small body needs protection. The grain that must last until the next delivery or harvest. And the hours somebody gives up because a child is sick. Rich families could purchase more protection. Poor families had to build more of it into ordinary life. That does not make poverty noble. Poverty is not simple living. It is expensive living without enough ways to pay. It makes it expensive in a different currency. Time, labor, sleep, food, and sometimes the health of the people doing the caring. The child may survive because someone else has been losing sleep, food, and time. So if you could walk into one of those houses at sunrise, the most important technology might not be the object that catches your eye. It might be the person who has been awake since midnight. If you enjoy history from the floor of the house instead of the throne room, hit like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what should we investigate next? The daily life of a poor Egyptian mother, or what happened when an Egyptian child became old enough to work? I'll see you in the next one.